Some mornings change everything, and for Eli Zook, that morning came with the smell of torn earth and the silence of missing cattle. For 68 years, this gentle Amish farmer had lived by faith, family, and the rhythm of the seasons in Lancaster County. Then he found the Burrow. It was massive, clawed deep into his wheat field, like something had fought its way up from hell itself. Eli said nothing for 3 days, hoping it would make sense, hoping it would go away. But when his grandson ran home, screaming about a pale man crawling through the woods, Eli knew his quiet world was over. This man, who had never touched a telephone in his life, walked to his English neighbor's house and dialed 911. What could terrify an Amish grandfather so deeply that he would break a lifetime of tradition? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning routine had been the same for 43 years of marriage. Sarah would rise first, her bare feet finding the cool wooden floors of their farmhouse before the sun painted the horizon pink. The smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee would drift upstairs, calling Eli from sleep like a gentle hand on his shoulder. By the time he dressed and made his way to the kitchen, she would have his favorite mug waiting, the one Samuel had made in school, with its uneven handle and the word "Gross Daddy" painted in crooked blue letters. This Tuesday morning felt no different, as Eli wrapped his weathered fingers around the ceramic warmth. Sarah moved about their kitchen with the grace of decades, her prayer cap pristine white against her graying hair. At 72, she possessed the quiet strength that came from raising 6 children and weathering Lancaster County's harsh winters alongside a man of few words. "The Millers are coming for supper Thursday," she said without looking, up from the bacon crackling in her cast-iron skillet. "Anna's bringing her apple butter." Eli nodded, watching through their window as the first light touched his wheat field. The stalks stood tall and golden, ready for harvest in another few weeks. This land had been in his family for 4 generations, passed down from his great-grandfather, who had settled here in 1892. Every morning for 68 years, Eli had looked out at these same rolling hills, watched the seasons change the colors from green to gold to the stark beauty of winter's white blanket. Samuel asked if he could spend Saturday night again. Sarah continued, settling across from him with her own coffee. Their grandson was 10 now, all knobby knees and curious questions, the youngest of their son Jacob's 4 children. "That boy loves this farm more than his own father did at that age." The comment carried the weight of old disappointment. Jacob had chosen a different path, working construction for English contractors, instead of staying on the land. It wasn't uncommon anymore. Young, Amish men seeking lives beyond the traditional boundaries. But it still stung like a splinter that never quite worked its way out. Eli reached for his hand-carved walking stick, a piece his own grandfather had shaped from oak, taken from this very property. The wood had darkened with age and countless hours of use, worn smooth by 3 generations of Zook hands. Every morning he carried it on his walk through the fields, checking fences, observing his cattle, feeling the pulse of the land beneath his feet. "I'll be checking the north pasture today," he said, standing and adjusting his black suspenders. Goliath seemed restless yesterday. Goliath was his prize Holstein bull, a massive creature with intelligent eyes and a temperament that had earned the respect of every farmer in the county. If Goliath was restless, there was usually a reason: a storm coming, a predator nearby, or something else disturbing the natural order of things. The screen door creaked as Eli stepped onto the porch, breathing in the crisp morning air that carried the scent of dew-dampened earth and the distant smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. His boots found their familiar rhythm on the dirt path that led through Sarah's vegetable garden, past the chicken coop where their hens were already scratching and clucking their morning greetings. The barn stood like a red sentinel against the landscape, its roof weathered but solid, housing the tools and equipment that made their simple life possible. Inside, their 6 Holstein cows waited for milking, their udders heavy with the night's production. Eli moved among them with practiced efficiency, his hands finding their familiar rhythm on the warm teats, the milk singing into the metal buckets with a steady, musical sound. It was during the milking that Eli often did his best thinking. The repetitive motion freed his mind to wander across the day's responsibilities, the upcoming harvest, the changing seasons. This morning, however, his thoughts kept drifting to his father's stories, tales the old man had shared during long winter evenings when work was light and time moved slowly. His father, Abraham Zook, had been a man haunted by shadows. He spoke little of his own father's death, only saying that great-grandfather Wilhelm had died defending the land when Abraham was barely 20. The details remained murky, lost to time, and his father's reluctance to revisit painful memories. Abraham had carried secrets to his grave 15 years ago, taking with him the weight of whatever knowledge had troubled his sleep and lined his face with worry. After milking, Eli guided the cattle to their pasture, watching as they settled into their morning routine of grazing and ruminating. Goliath stood apart from the herd, his massive head raised, nostrils flaring, as if testing the air for something that shouldn't be there. The bull's behavior troubled Eli more than he cared to admit. The wheat field stretched before him like a golden sea, the heads heavy with grain that would soon fill their granary and provide flour for Sarah's bread through the coming winter. Eli had walked these same rows thousands of times, knew every rise and depression, every stone that might catch a plow blade, every wet spot that stayed muddy longer than the rest after spring rains. But today, something was different. At first, he thought it might be moles. The little creatures occasionally created raised tunnels that could trip an unwary walker. But as he approached the disturbance, Eli's steps slowed, then stopped altogether. The wheat in a rough circle, perhaps 20 feet across, had been flattened, not from above, as if something heavy had fallen from the sky, but from below, as if the earth itself had pushed upward with tremendous force. In the center of this circle, a hole yawned dark and wide, larger than any mole tunnel, larger than any groundhog burrow Eli had ever seen. He approached cautiously, his walking stick extended before him like a blind man testing unfamiliar ground. The hole was roughly circular, perhaps 4 feet across, with edges that seemed to have been clawed rather than dug. Loose earth scattered around the opening, mixed with chunks of clay that should have been buried much deeper. Eli knelt at the edge, careful not to get too close, and peered into the darkness. The hole descended beyond the reach of morning sunlight, and from its depths came a smell that made his stomach clench, something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in summer heat mixed with the mineral scent of deep earth. A sound drifted up from below, faint but unmistakable, a scratching as if something with claws was moving against stone. Eli jerked back, his heart hammering against his ribs. In 68 years of farming, he had encountered every manner of wildlife that called Pennsylvania home. Bears occasionally, foxes and raccoons regularly, even mountain lions, though they were rare and mostly kept to themselves. But nothing in his experience had made a burrow like this, and nothing should be making those sounds from so deep underground. He stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement, and looked around the field with new eyes. The wheat around the hole wasn't just flattened, it was dead. The golden stalks turned brown and brittle, as if something toxic had leached up from below. For several long minutes, Eli stood in his field, holding his grandfather's walking stick, staring at something that shouldn't exist. The rational part of his mind searched for explanations. Perhaps a water main had burst, though there were no water lines in this field. Maybe a sinkhole, though the limestone bedrock in this area was solid. Possibly some kind of animal, though he couldn't imagine what creature could excavate something this size. The scratching sound came again, louder this time, accompanied by what might have been breathing, deep, labored inhalations that seemed to echo up from far below. Eli turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, his pace deliberately measured, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. He was a man of faith, raised to trust in God's plan and to meet life's challenges with prayer and steady work. But he was also a farmer, practical and grounded in the realities of soil and weather and the creatures that shared this land, and nothing in his experience prepared him for what he had found in his wheat field. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when he returned, wooden clothespins held between her teeth as she wrestled with a wet sheet in the morning breeze. She glanced at him as he approached, noting something in his expression that made her pause. "What is it?" she asked around the clothespins. Eli opened his mouth to tell her, then stopped. What would he say? That he had found a hole that shouldn't exist? That something was moving in the depths of their farm? Something that made sounds no animal should make? "Just checking the fences," he said finally. "Everything's fine." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. After 43 years of marriage, she knew when to press and when to let silence carry the conversation. But her eyes held questions that Eli wasn't ready to answer. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks, made strange by the knowledge of what lay hidden in his wheat field. Eli found reasons to avoid that section of the farm, working instead on repairing a gate in the far pasture, cleaning tools. In the barn, helping Sarah with the endless tasks that kept their household running. But as evening approached, and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Eli found his steps carrying him back toward the wheat field. He told himself he needed to check on the disturbance, to see if anything had changed, perhaps to discover some rational explanation that daylight had hidden. The hole was still there, still wrong, still emanating that sick, sweet smell that made his throat close. If anything, it seemed larger, as if whatever had created it was still digging, still clawing its way toward the surface from some deep, dark place below. And as Eli stood at the edge of his ruined wheat, watching shadows gather in the depths of that impossible burrow, he heard something that would haunt his dreams for days to come. A sound that was almost human, almost like crying, but distorted by distance and desperation into something that no creature of God's earth should ever make. That night, for the first time in his adult life, Eli Zook did not sleep. The second night brought no rest, only restless turning and the sound of Sarah's gentle breathing beside him while his mind circled back to that hole like a moth drawn to flame. When dawn finally crept through their bedroom window, Eli rose with the weight of sleeplessness heavy on his shoulders, but also with grim determination. Whatever was happening in his field, he would face it as his forefathers had faced their troubles, with faith, patience, and steady work. Sarah said nothing about the dark circles under his eyes, or the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee mug. She simply placed an extra piece of bacon on his plate and hummed a hymn while she worked, filling their kitchen with the comfort of familiar melody. After breakfast, Eli made his way to the barn for morning chores, but his eyes kept drifting toward the wheat field. In the early light, he could see where the disturbed earth had spread overnight, as if whatever was below had pushed more soil to the surface. The circle of dead wheat had grown larger too, the brown stalks forming an expanding ring around the central burrow. The cattle sensed his unease. Even gentle Bessie, normally eager for her morning grain, shied away from his approach. Goliath stood at the far end of the pasture, his massive head turned toward the wheat field, muscles tense beneath his black and white hide. It was while Eli was carrying water to the chicken coop that he noticed Goliath's behavior had changed. The bull wasn't just watchful, he was afraid. 2,000 pounds of powerful animal, bred for strength and stubbornness, was backing away from something invisible, his great head swinging from side to side like he was tracking movement Eli couldn't see. Then Eli saw the tracks. They led from the burrow toward the barn, pressed deep into the soft earth where yesterday's brief rain had left the ground receptive to impressions. At first glance, they might have been human footprints, but the proportions were wrong. Too long? Too narrow, with what appeared to be claw marks extending beyond where toes should end. Eli knelt beside the clearest print, his weathered hands hovering above the impression without quite touching. The track was nearly twice the length of his own foot, with 5 distinct digit marks that pressed deeper at the tips, as if whatever had made them walked on claws rather than flesh. A cold understanding settled in his stomach. Something had emerged from that burrow during the night. Something had walked across his farm, close enough to his house that it could have looked through their windows, could have. A sharp crack from the direction of the wheat field made Eli's head snap up. One of the wooden fence posts that marked the field's boundary had split lengthwise, the wood splintered as if tremendous pressure had been applied from below. Even as he watched, another post began to lean, its base pushed askew by some underground force. That was when he noticed Goliath was missing. Eli ran to the pasture fence, his heart pounding as he scanned the field where his prize bull should have been grazing with the rest of the herd. The other cattle clustered together at the far end of the enclosure, huddled like sheep seeking protection from a wolf. But Goliath was nowhere to be seen. The gate hung open, its latch somehow worked free during the night. Beyond it, the strange tracks led away from the farm, following a path that curved back toward the woods that bordered the Zook property. Eli followed them with growing dread, noting how they seemed to avoid the direct sunlight, keeping to shadows and depressions where morning fog still clung to the ground. At the edge of the woods, the tracks disappeared into a tangle of undergrowth, but Eli could see where branches had been broken, where the underbrush had been pushed aside by the passage of something large. And there, caught on a thorn bush at the height of a man's chest, was a scrap of fabric that made his blood run cold. It was a piece of a child's straw hat, torn and stained with something dark that wasn't mud. Eli recognized it immediately. The hat Sarah had made for their grandson, Samuel, woven from wheat stalks and decorated with a blue ribbon that matched the boy's eyes. But Samuel was safe at home with his parents, miles away in the village, wasn't he? Eli's hands shook as he carefully removed the fabric from the thorns, noting the way the edges were not cut but torn, as if ripped away by force. The stain was dried blood, he realized, though not much of it, just enough to suggest injury, not death. The sound that rose from deeper in the woods was barely human, a low, keening wail that spoke of pain and terror and something else, something that made the hair on Eli's arms stand on end. It was answered by another sound, deeper and more guttural, like a large dog's growl, stretched and distorted until it became something else entirely. Eli backed away from the woods, the piece of hat clutched in his fist, his mind racing through possibilities. Samuel was safe. He had to be, but other children lived in the area, other families with young ones who might have wandered too far from home, who might have been curious about strange sounds in the night. He turned and ran back toward the farmhouse, his aging legs carrying him faster than they had in years, driven by a fear that went beyond the rational. Sarah met him at the kitchen door, her face pale with worry at his obvious distress. Eli, "What? Get inside," he commanded, pushing past her into the house. "Lock the doors, all of them." Sarah stared at him in shock. In all their years together, she had never heard that tone in his voice, never seen that particular kind of fear in his eyes. "Eli, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" He showed her the piece of Samuel's hat, watching as her face went white. "Something took Goliath," he said quietly, "and I think it might have hurt a child." Sarah sank into her kitchen chair, one hand pressed to her chest. "Samuel, call Jacob," Eli said. "Use the phone at Morrison's. Make sure Samuel is safe." The Morrisons were their English neighbors, good people who had lived beside the Zook farm for nearly 20 years. Tom Morrison had offered many times to let them use his telephone in emergencies, understanding that the Amish reluctance to embrace modern technology didn't extend to matters of life and death. But as Eli stood in his kitchen, staring at the blood-stained fabric in his palm, he realized that calling to check on Samuel was only the beginning. Whatever was happening on his farm was beyond his ability to handle alone. For the first time, In his adult life, he was going to have to reach out to the English world for help. The walk to the Morrison farm felt like the longest mile of his life. Tom Morrison was working in his garage when Eli appeared at his door, and the younger man took one look at the Amish farmer's face and immediately led him to the phone without asking questions. Eli's hands trembled as he dialed his son's number, each ring seeming to stretch for hours until Jacob's familiar voice answered. "Samuel is fine, Dad," Jacob assured him after Eli's careful questions. "He's right here, helping Mary with the laundry." "Why?" Relief flooded through Eli, but it was tempered by the knowledge that if it wasn't Samuel's blood on that hat, it belonged to some other child. "Keep him close today," he said finally. "Don't let him out of your sight." After he hung up, Eli stood in the Morrison kitchen, staring at the phone as if it were some alien artifact. Tom Morrison waited patiently, sensing that his neighbor was wrestling with a decision that went against everything he had been taught. "Tom," Eli said finally, "I need to call the police." The words felt like sacrilege in his mouth. The Amish handled their own problems, settled their own disputes, dealt with their own tragedies without involving the English authorities. But this was beyond anything his community was equipped to handle. Tom Morrison nodded gravely and dialed 911, then handed the phone to Eli with quiet understanding. "Juan, what's your emergency?" For a moment, Eli couldn't speak. How could he explain what he had found? How could he make them understand that something was very wrong on his farm without sounding like an old man telling ghost stories? "My name is Eli Zook," he said finally. "I live on Maple Grove Road, about 3 miles east of Paradise. I think something has taken my cattle and hurt a child." The dispatcher's voice was professional and calm. "Sir, can you describe what happened?" Eli looked out Tom Morrison's window toward his own farm, where the wheat field held its terrible secret, where strange tracks led into dark woods, where something waited in the depths of the earth that no amount of faith or prayer seemed able to touch. "I think you'd better send someone out here to see for yourself," he said quietly. "Because I don't think you'd believe me if I told you." Sheriff Bradley arrived 45 minutes later, his patrol car kicking up dust as it turned into the Morrison driveway. He was a tall man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of steady demeanor that comes from 20 years of dealing with everything from domestic disputes to drunk drivers. Deputy Kane followed in a second vehicle, younger and more skeptical, his hand resting unconsciously on his radio as if already preparing to call for backup or psychiatric evaluation. Tom Morrison introduced Eli to the officers with the quiet respect that existed between long-time neighbors, then tactfully withdrew to give them privacy. Eli found himself standing beside the emergency phone, a simple black device mounted on the Morrison kitchen wall, feeling like it represented everything foreign and overwhelming about the modern world he had tried so hard to avoid. "Mr. Zook," Sheriff Bradley said, pulling out a small notebook. "Tom tells me you've never called 911 before. Must be something serious to bring you here today." Eli nodded, unsure how to begin. In the harsh light of afternoon, with these practical men waiting for his explanation, the morning's discovery seemed almost dreamlike. But the piece of blood-stained hat was still in his pocket, and Goliath was still missing. "Something is wrong on my farm," he said simply. "In my wheat field, and my bull is gone." Deputy Kane glanced at his partner with barely concealed impatience. Cattle theft wasn't uncommon in rural areas, and while it was certainly a crime, it hardly warranted the mysterious urgency in the old Amish man's voice. "Can you show us what you're talking about?" Sheriff Bradley asked, more diplomatically. The walk back to the Zook farm felt like a pilgrimage to Eli, each step carrying him closer to something he still couldn't fully accept. Sarah met them at the kitchen door, her face carefully composed despite the worry lines around her eyes. She nodded politely to the officers and offered coffee, which they declined, then stepped back to let the men pass. "The field is this way," Eli said, leading them along the dirt path he had walked countless times. But today, the familiar route felt different. charged with an undercurrent of dread that made even the cheerful morning birdsong seem ominous. Sheriff Bradley saw the hole first, his stride faltering as they crested the small rise that overlooked the wheat field. From a distance, the damage was clearly visible, a circle of dead grain surrounding a dark opening that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Jesus," Deputy Kane muttered, then caught himself and glanced apologetically at Eli. "Sorry, Mr. Zook, it's just, what the hell made that?" They approached the burrow cautiously, the officers' training evident in the way they positioned themselves and scanned the surrounding area for potential threats. Sheriff Bradley knelt at the edge of the hole, his flashlight beam disappearing into depths that seemed to swallow the light. "How deep does this go?" he asked. "I don't know," Eli replied honestly. "But there are sounds and tracks." He led them to the clearest footprints, watching as both men's expressions grew increasingly troubled. Deputy Kane took photographs with a small digital camera, muttering measurements and observations under his breath. "These aren't like any animal tracks I've seen," Sheriff Bradley said finally. "You mentioned your bull is missing." Eli showed them the broken gate, the path through the pasture where Goliath's hoofprints mingled with the strange claw marks, the trail that led toward the woods. And finally, reluctantly, he pulled out the piece of Samuel's hat. "Found this caught on thorns at the wood's edge," he said, watching both men's faces grow serious. "It's my grandson's, but he's safe at home. Someone else's child." "We need to call this in," Deputy Kane said immediately, reaching for his radio. Sheriff Bradley held up a hand to stop him. "Let's take this step by step. Mr. Zook, you said there were sounds coming from the hole?" As if summoned by his words, a low scraping noise drifted up from the burrow's depths, followed by what might have been breathing, deep, labored inhalations that echoed strangely in the confined space. Both officers drew their service weapons instinctively, their training overriding rational thought. Something was definitely alive down there, something large enough to make sounds they could hear from the surface. "We need a bigger team," Sheriff Bradley said grimly. "And maybe someone who knows about geology. This isn't just a missing cattle case anymore." It was Deputy Kane who suggested calling Dr. Elizabeth Harper. She was a geologist at Franklin and Marshall College who had helped the county before when sinkhole concerns arose near new construction. If anyone could make sense of the bizarre excavation in Eli's field, it would be her. While they waited for her arrival, the officers cordoned off the area around the burrow with yellow tape, treating it like a crime scene, despite having no clear evidence of what crime might have been committed. Eli watched them work with fascination and growing unease. The simple act of involving authorities had transformed his quiet farm into something official and serious. Drawing attention he had never wanted, Dr. Harper arrived in a dusty jeep filled with equipment, her grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her clothes bearing the stains of fieldwork. She was in her early 60s, with the kind of competent manner that spoke of decades spent studying the Earth's mysteries. Her first look at the burrow stopped her mid-sentence in whatever greeting she had been preparing. "That's not natural," she said immediately, dropping her equipment bag and approaching the hole with professional fascination, overriding caution. The excavation pattern, the soil displacement, something dug this from below, working upward. She began taking measurements, soil samples, photographs from every angle. Her instruments, devices Eli couldn't identify, beeped and clicked as she worked, recording data that meant nothing to him but clearly troubled her. "The seismic readings are impossible," she muttered after 20 minutes of work. "There's activity deep below that shouldn't exist in this geological formation. And these soil samples," she held up a plastic bag filled with dark earth from the burrow's edge. "This contains minerals that shouldn't be present at this depth. Iron sulfides, rare earth elements, things that belong much deeper in the geological column." Sheriff Bradley exchanged glances with his deputy. "What are you saying, Doc?" "I'm saying whatever dug this hole came from very deep underground, deeper than any known animal burrows in this region. And the continued seismic activity suggests it's still active down there." As if to emphasize her point, Another sound drifted up from the depths, a scraping like claws against stone, followed by what unmistakably sounded like a low, mournful cry. Dr. Harper stepped back from the hole, her scientific curiosity now tempered with caution. We need ground-penetrating radar, proper excavation equipment, maybe even spelunking gear if we're going to explore this properly. And we need to check on neighboring farms, Sheriff Bradley added. If this is part of some larger geological event, other properties might be affected. As the afternoon wore on, Eli found himself relegated to the role of observer on his own land. The authorities had taken control with quiet efficiency, transforming his private crisis into a public investigation. He appreciated their competence, but part of him missed the simpler time when his problems were his own to solve. It was near sunset when Tom Morrison came walking across the field with news that made everyone's blood run cold. "Sheriff," he called out, "you need to know. The Johnson farm, about 2 miles south. They found one of their steers this morning. What was left of it. And there's another hole in their pasture, just like this one." Dr. Harper's equipment worked through the night, portable generators humming as sensors mapped the underground network that seemed to connect multiple farms across Lancaster County. By morning, the scope of the situation had become clear and terrifying. The soil samples told a story that challenged everything she knew about geology and biology. These mineral traces, she explained to the growing group of officials gathered in Eli's kitchen, they're consistent with deep earth composition, but they're mixed with organic compounds I can't identify. Something biological has been moving through underground spaces for a very long time. Sheriff Bradley had called in the state police, and Agent Maria Santos from the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency sat at Sarah's kitchen table, her laptop displaying maps dotted with red markers indicating confirmed Burrow sites. 7 farms now reported similar excavations, forming a rough circle approximately 5 miles in diameter. "The pattern suggests a central nexus," Agent Santos said, pointing to the screen. "If these are all connected underground, there's likely a main chamber or nest somewhere in the middle of this area." Eli listened from his position by the window, watching as his quiet farm transformed into something resembling a military operation. Television news trucks had arrived during the night, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters with perfectly styled hair and serious expressions delivered breathless updates about the mysterious excavations that had authorities baffled. The invasion of his privacy troubled Eli deeply, but what disturbed him more was the change in his animals. The remaining cattle huddled together in the far corner of their pasture, refusing to approach the side nearest the wheat field. The chickens had stopped laying eggs. Even Sarah's cat, ancient and usually fearless, spent its time hiding under the porch, emerging only to hiss at empty air. It was Samuel's arrival that brought the first real breakthrough. Jacob had driven out from town against Eli's wishes, bringing his youngest son, despite the obvious danger. The boy was pale and quiet, his usual chatter replaced by an unsettling stillness that made the adults exchange worried glances. "Gross Daddy," Samuel said quietly, tugging at Eli's sleeve, "there's a man in the field. He doesn't have any eyes." The adults stopped their conversation abruptly. Dr. Harper looked up from her instruments. Agent Santos paused her typing, and Sheriff Bradley set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Samuel," Eli said gently, kneeling to meet his grandson's eyes, "what do you mean?" "By the big hole," the boy continued matter-of-factly. "He's very pale and he walks funny, like his legs don't work right. But he doesn't have any eyes, just dark holes where they should be." Jacob started to chide his son for making up stories, but Eli held up a hand to stop him. There was something in Samuel's voice, a certainty that spoke of truth rather than imagination. "When did you see this man?" Eli asked. "Now," Samuel replied, pointing toward the window. "He's watching the people with the machines." Every adult in the room turned toward the wheat field, but the afternoon sun created a glare that made it difficult to see. In details, Dr. Harper grabbed her binoculars and focused them on the area around the burrow. "I don't see anything," she said, after a long moment. "He's there," Samuel insisted, his small hand gripping Eli's arm. "And he's hungry. Really, really hungry." A chill settled over the room that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Agent Santos was already reaching for her radio when Samuel spoke again. "Gross Daddy, why does the ground feel angry?" Before anyone could respond, Dr. Harper's seismic equipment began alarm, not the steady beeping they had grown accustomed to, but a sharp, urgent wailing that indicated significant underground movement. "Everyone out of the house," she commanded, grabbing her most essential equipment. "Major seismic event right now." They barely made it to the yard before the ground began to shake. Not the rolling motion of an earthquake, but a violent, localized tremor centered on the wheat field. The burrow seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting like a massive breathing lung, and from its depths came sounds that no geological event should produce: howling, scraping, and something that sounded almost like screaming. The news crews turned their cameras toward the disturbance, capturing footage that would dominate cable news for weeks. But the professional reporters fell silent as a figure emerged from the burrow, not climbing out, but flowing upward like smoke given form. It had been human once, perhaps, but whatever it was now defied easy description. Pale skin stretched tight over elongated bones, limbs that bent at impossible angles, and where eyes should have been, empty sockets that seemed to absorb light. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as if its body was being controlled by something that didn't quite understand how human anatomy worked. Samuel buried his face against Eli's chest, but the boy's words carried clearly in the sudden silence. "See? No eyes. And he's really, really hungry." The creature turned its eyeless face toward the assembled crowd, its mouth opening to reveal rows of teeth that no human had ever possessed. The sound it made was part scream, part roar, and part something else entirely, a noise that seemed to bypass the ears and strike directly at the primitive fear centers of the brain. Sheriff Bradley drew his weapon, but Agent Santos stopped him with a gesture. "We don't know what we're dealing with," she said quietly. "Let's not provoke it." Dr. Harper's scientific mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The bone structure, the way it moves, it's like something adapted to an underground environment, but based on human physiology. How is that possible? The creature took a step toward them, then another, its movements becoming more coordinated, as if it was learning to use its malformed body. Behind it, more shapes began emerging from the burrow, similar figures, but in various states of decay and transformation. "How many?" Agent Santos whispered into her radio. "We need immediate evacuation of the area. All civilians out now." But even as she spoke, they could hear similar sounds coming from other directions, the other burrows, the other farms, all seemingly activated by whatever was happening at the central nexus on Eli's property. Sarah appeared at Eli's side, her face pale but determined. "The children," she said simply. "All the children in the county. If these things are spreading..." She didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone present understood the implications. Whatever these creatures were, wherever they had come from, they were no longer contained to isolated farm burrows. They were emerging across Lancaster County, and their intentions were clearly hostile. Samuel looked up at his grandfather with eyes too old for his young face. "Gross Daddy," he said quietly, "I can hear them thinking. They're looking for something. Something they lost a long time ago. What are they looking for?" Eli asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Family," Samuel replied. "They want their family back, and they think we took it from them." That evening, while emergency responders evacuated a 3-mile radius around the affected farms, Eli climbed the narrow stairs to his attic for the first time in years. The space smelled of old wood and forgotten memories, thick with dust that danced in the beam of his flashlight. Sarah followed behind him, her concerns about his secretiveness finally outweighing her respect for his privacy. "Eli, what are you looking for up here?" she asked, watching as he moved boxes and old furniture with purpose that suggested he knew exactly what he sought. "My great-grandfather's things," he replied. pulling away a canvas tarp that covered an old wooden chest. Father always said Wilhelm kept records of everything that happened on this land. If these creatures have been here before, the chest was made of solid oak, darkened with age, and bearing the simple craftsmanship that marked it as handmade by someone who understood both wood and time. The iron hinges protested as Eli lifted the lid, revealing contents that had been undisturbed for decades. On top lay a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by handling. Below that were maps drawn on heavy paper, showing the farm's boundaries as they existed in the late 1800s. And beneath everything, wrapped in oiled cloth, was something that made Sarah gasp, a collection of newspaper clippings and handwritten accounts dating back to 1892. Eli lifted out the journal with reverent hands. The leather binding bore his great-grandfather's initials, WZ, carved in simple block letters. The pages within were filled with Wilhelm's careful handwriting, switching between English and Pennsylvania Dutch as his emotions demanded. September 15, 1892, Eli read aloud, translating the German script. They have returned as grandfather warned they would. The earth opens like wounds, and the Der Erdgeist crawl forth seeking what was taken from them. But we are ready this time. The boundaries hold. Sarah moved closer, her practical nature warring with growing unease. Earth spirits? Eli, what is this talking about? He turned the page, finding a hand-drawn map that matched the current layout of their farm with startling accuracy. But this map showed additional features: 7 stones arranged in a specific pattern around the property, connected by lines that formed a complex geometric design. The containment, Eli whispered, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. Great-grandfather didn't just farm this land. He was guarding something. The journal's entries painted a picture of events that mirrored their current crisis with terrifying precision. Creatures emerging from deep burrows, livestock disappearing, children reporting sightings of pale men without eyes. But Wilhelm's account also contained something their current situation lacked: a solution. The stones must be maintained. Eli continued reading. Each generation must remember the old ways, must know where the boundaries lie. The Der Erdgeist sleep deeply, but they wake when the barriers weaken. Father paid the price for forgetting. I will not let his sacrifice be meaningless. Sarah sat heavily on an old trunk, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. Your father, she said quietly. Abraham never told you how Wilhelm died, did he? Eli shook his head, but kept reading, finding entries that described a pattern of emergence every 30 to 40 years, always following the same sequence: first the burrows, then the missing animals. Finally, the creatures themselves crawling up from whatever deep places they called home. Listen to this, he said, finding a particularly detailed entry. October 3rd, 1892. The young ones adapt quickly to our air, but the old ones remain mostly below. They fear the iron boundaries will not cross where the blessed stones mark the sacred ground. But if the stones are moved or broken, they spread like infection through the earth itself. More pieces fell into place as Eli read. The newspaper clippings told of mysterious disappearances across Lancaster County in 1892, of livestock found drained of blood, of children who claimed to see cavemen in the woods. But the reports stopped abruptly in late October of that year, with no explanation for the sudden end to the phenomena. He stopped them, Eli realized. Somehow, Wilhelm stopped them and set up boundaries to keep them contained. A loose page fell from the journal as he turned it, revealing what appeared to be a letter written in Wilhelm's shakier handwriting. Dated years later, to my descendants, the burden passes to each generation. The stones grow weak with time and must be renewed. The old words must be spoken, the old ways remembered. When the signs appear, the earth opening, the cattle vanishing, the pale ones walking, know that the time has come again. Do not face them with modern weapons. Do not seek help from those who do not understand. The power that contains them is older than steel, deeper than science. Faith, blood, and the proper rituals are your only weapons against the hungry dark. Sarah's hand found Eli's shoulder. "The stones he mentions, do you know where they are?" Eli studied the hand-drawn map, comparing it to his mental picture of their current farm. "Some of them. There's one by the old oak near the creek, another at the corner where our property meets the Morrisons, but the map shows 7, and I can only account for 3. What happened to the others?" The answer came to him with sickening clarity. "Progress. Modern farming. We moved them without knowing what they were. Probably used them for fence posts or building foundations. The implications settled over them like a burial shroud. The containment Wilhelm had died to establish had been slowly weakened over generations of unknowing descendants. Each stone moved or broken had created gaps in whatever mystical barrier held the creatures below ground. Footsteps on the stairs interrupted their discovery. Jacob's voice called up from below. "Dad, the sheriff needs to talk to you." They found more burrows. Eli carefully closed the journal, but not before noting one final chilling entry. "They remember us as we remember them. The bloodline carries the key to both their prison and their freedom. Beware the children who hear their voices. They are closest to the old knowledge, but also most vulnerable to the whispers from below." Downstairs, Sheriff Bradley waited with Agent Santos and a man Eli didn't recognize. Tall, thin, wearing a government suit that marked him as someone from much higher up the chain of authority than local law enforcement. "Mr. Zook," the stranger said, extending his hand. "I'm Agent David Harrison, Department of Homeland Security. We need to talk about what's been happening on your property." Eli shook the offered hand cautiously. "I'm not sure what I can tell you that you don't already know. Actually, sir, we're hoping you can tell us quite a bit. You see, this isn't the first time we've encountered something like this. There have been similar incidents in other rural communities, always following the same pattern, always centered on properties that have been in the same families for generations." Agent Harrison opened a briefcase and withdrew a stack of files. "Pennsylvania in 1892, as you experienced. Vermont in 1924. Ohio in 1957. Each time, the incidents stop abruptly after a few weeks, and there's never any official explanation. But each location has certain commonalities. Isolated farming communities, families with deep historical ties to the land, and geological formations that suggest extensive underground cave systems." He paused, studying Eli's face carefully. "What we've never had before is a survivor who might have family records from the previous incident. Your great-grandfather's name appears in some of the 1892 reports. We believe he knew how to stop these things." Eli felt the weight of the journal in his hands, the knowledge that 3 generations of his family had carried in secret. "What makes you think I know anything about it?" "Because," Agent Harrison said quietly, "your grandson has been describing these creatures with impossible accuracy, including details we haven't released to the public. And because preliminary geological surveys show that your property sits at the center of what appears to be a vast underground network, one that's been there for a very, very long time." Sarah moved to stand beside her husband, her presence offering strength and solidarity. "What do you want from us?" "We want to stop this before it spreads beyond Lancaster County," Agent Harrison replied. "And we think the answer lies in whatever your great-grandfather knew. Knowledge that may have been passed down through your family, even if you don't realize you have it." Eli looked at his wife, then at his son, finally at his grandson who sat quietly in the corner, his young eyes holding shadows that no child should carry. The burden Wilhelm had written about was real, and it had found its way to another generation of Zooks. "I may have something that could help," he said finally. "But you need to understand, this isn't something you can fight with modern weapons or solve with government resources. If my great-grandfather was right, the solution requires older methods." Agent Harrison nodded grimly. "At this point, Mr. Zook, we're willing to try anything." The community meeting took place in the Paradise Township Fire Hall, a building that had hosted everything from wedding receptions to town council sessions, but never anything quite like this. Bishop Miller presided with the quiet authority that came with leading the local Amish community through 40 years of challenges. But even his steady presence couldn't entirely calm the fear that filled the room like smoke. Families sat together in tight clusters, parents keeping their children close. The normal boundaries between Amish and English temporarily dissolved by shared danger. Dr. Harper had set up her equipment in one corner, seismic monitors beeping softly as they tracked the continuing underground activity. The creatures had retreated to their burrows at dawn, but the readings showed they were still moving below ground, perhaps preparing for another emergence. Eli stood before the assembled crowd with Wilhelm's journal open in his hands, the iron horseshoe that had hung in his barn for generations tucked in his jacket pocket. Sarah had found it that morning, hidden behind feed sacks, exactly where the journal indicated a protective charm should be placed. Blessed iron, shaped by hands that understood its true purpose. My great-grandfather wrote about these things, Eli began, his voice carrying clearly in the silent hall. He called them der Erdgeist, earth spirits. But they're not spirits at all. They're something else, something that's been sleeping deep underground for generations. Agent Harrison nodded for him to continue, while Agent Santos monitored radio traffic from multiple agencies now converging on Lancaster County. The National Guard had established a perimeter, but their presence felt inadequate against a threat that emerged from below and could appear anywhere within a 5-mile radius. According to Wilhelm's records, Eli continued, these creatures have been here much longer than any of our families. The land we farm, the ground we've built our lives on, it's been their territory for centuries, maybe longer. They sleep deep, but they wake when they sense changes above. Too much activity, too many people, too much disruption of the old patterns. Bishop Miller leaned forward in his chair. And your great-grandfather found a way to make them sleep again? Eli nodded, though the knowledge carried a weight that made his shoulders ache. Boundaries. 7 stones, placed in specific locations, blessed with prayers that go back to the old country. They create a cage, I suppose, not to trap the creatures permanently, but to contain them to the deep places where they can't harm the surface world. Dr. Harper looked up from her instruments. That's actually consistent with what we're seeing geologically. The seismic activity is concentrated in deep cave systems, interconnected chambers that extend far below the normal water table. If something were placed at strategic points on the surface, it might theoretically influence pressure systems or acoustic properties underground. Science and faith working together, Agent Harrison observed. What happened to the original boundary stones? Sarah answered before Eli could respond, her voice carrying the regret of generations. We moved them. Over the years, as farming changed, as we built new fences and roads, we moved the stones without knowing what they were. Some probably became foundation stones for barns or houses. Others might have been broken up for smaller projects. A murmur of understanding rippled through the Amish families present. How many times had they all repurposed old fieldstones for new construction, never thinking about their original purpose or placement? Samuel spoke up from where he sat between his parents, his young voice cutting through the adult discussion with startling clarity. They're angry because we broke their cage. But they're scared too. They don't like the light or the noise up here. They just want to go back to sleep. Agent Santos stopped her radio monitoring to stare at the boy. Samuel, how do you know that? I can hear them, he replied matter-of-factly. Not words exactly, but feelings. They're really old and really tired, and they hurt because the air up here isn't right for them. They're looking for the way back down, but they can't find it because the paths are confused. Dr. Harper set down her equipment and focused entirely on Samuel. The paths are confused. The stone paths. The ones that used to guide them home. Great-great-gross-daddy built them like a map, so the Erdgeist could follow them back to the deep places when they finished hunting. But now the map is broken. A chill settled over the room as the implications became clear. The boundary stones hadn't just been a barrier. They had been a guidance system, a way for the creatures to find their way back to the depths after their surface activities. Without the stones, the creatures were effectively lost, trapped in a world that was hostile to their nature. So we need to rebuild the boundaries, Eli said, though he dreaded the complexity of the task ahead. Find the original locations, place new stones, and somehow perform whatever rituals Wilhelm used to activate them. Bishop Miller stood slowly, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. Brother Eli, the knowledge your great-grandfather possessed, the old prayers, the ritual words, do you have them? Eli shook his head reluctantly. The journal has maps and descriptions, but the actual ceremonies, those were passed down through spoken tradition, father to son. My father died before he could teach me. The silence that followed was heavy with despair. Without the proper rituals, the boundary stones would be nothing more than rocks placed in a field. The creatures would remain trapped on the surface, growing more desperate and dangerous with each passing night. It was Samuel who broke the silence again, his childish voice carrying impossible wisdom. Grostadi, you know the words. You just don't remember knowing them. Eli stared at his grandson in confusion. Samuel, what do you mean? The Erdgeist remember everything. They remember your great-great-Grostadi, and they remember the words he spoke. If you listen, really listen, they'll teach you. Agent Harrison leaned forward intently. Are you saying these creatures might cooperate with us? Samuel nodded solemnly. They don't want to hurt people. They just want to go home. But they're getting hungrier and more scared every day they're stuck up here. Some of the older ones, the ones that have been sleeping longest, they're starting to forget that people aren't food. Dr. Harper checked her readings again, noting increased activity across all the Burrow sites. The seismic activity is escalating. Whatever's happening underground, it's building towards something significant. As if summoned by her words, the lights in the fire hall flickered, and a low, rumbling sound came from beneath their feet. Through the windows, they could see emergency flares being lit around the established perimeter as something large moved through the underground tunnels, causing the earth above to shift and crack. Samuel stood up suddenly, his face pale with urgency. They're coming up again. All of them this time. The old ones are awake now, and they're really, really hungry. The rumbling increased, and outside, car alarms began wailing as the ground shook with increasing intensity. Agent Santos was shouting into her radio, calling for immediate evacuation, while Dr. Harper's equipment registered seismic activity, unlike anything in the region's recorded history. But Eli found himself moving towards Samuel, kneeling before his grandson with sudden understanding. You can really hear them. The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face. They're so scared, Grostadi, and so hungry. They haven't eaten in so long, and the surface food doesn't help them. They need to get back to the deep places where their real food grows. Then help me listen, Eli said quietly, placing his hands on Samuel's shoulders. Help me hear what great-grandfather heard. Help me remember the words that will guide them home. As chaos erupted around them, emergency vehicles racing through the night, radios crackling with urgent reports. The ground itself seeming to pulse with malevolent life. Grandfather and grandson closed their eyes and reached out with senses beyond the physical, seeking the ancient knowledge that might save them all. The revelation came not through Samuel's psychic connection with the creatures, but through Agent Harrison's classified files spread across the fire hall's folding tables. As the ground shook beneath them and emergency sirens wailed in the distance, Harrison opened a file marked with security classifications that spoke of decades of government knowledge and deliberate concealment. We've been tracking these incidents for over a century, he said, his professional composure cracking as the building swayed around them. Pennsylvania, 1892. Vermont, 1924. Ohio, 1957. Arkansas, 1981. Montana, 2003. Always the same pattern. Always ending the same way, with complete media blackout and official denial. Eli looked up from his grandson, confusion mixing with dawning horror. You've known about these creatures all along? Not just known about them, Agent Harrison replied grimly. We've been managing them. The boundary stones your great-grandfather placed, they weren't just family knowledge. They were part of a larger network. A systematic containment protocol developed by the federal government in partnership with certain, let's call them hereditary guardians. Sarah's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Guardians? Harrison nodded toward Eli with something that might have been respect or pity. Families like yours, Mr. Zook. Bloodlines that have maintained the old knowledge for generations, usually without fully understanding what they were protecting. The Amish were particularly suited for this work. Isolated communities, strong oral traditions, deep suspicion of outside interference. The ground shook again, more violently this time, and through the firehall's windows they could see strange lights dancing around the distant Burrow sites. Not the harsh glare of emergency floodlights, but something organic and phosphorescent that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. Dr. Harper stared at the seismic readings with growing alarm. The activity is off the charts. It's like something massive is moving through interconnected chambers below the entire county. Agent Harrison continued his revelation with the urgency of a man running out of time. The creatures aren't invaders, Mr. Zook. They're refugees. Climate refugees, in a sense, though the climate they're fleeing from changed thousands of years ago. He pulled out geological surveys that showed the underground cave systems in unprecedented detail. These tunnels, these chambers, they're not natural formations. They're cities, Mr. Zook. Ancient cities built by the creatures when they lived on the surface. Before some catastrophic change drove them underground, Eli felt the world shifting around him. Everything he thought he understood about his family's burden crumbling like poorly mortared stone. Cities? The Ice Age, Dr. Harper breathed, studying the survey maps. The Pleistocene glaciation. These creatures were surface dwellers who were forced underground when the climate changed. They've been down there for 12,000 years, slowly adapting to subterranean life, waiting for conditions to improve on the surface. Samuel's voice cut through the adults' discussion with chilling clarity. They're not waiting anymore. The deep cities are dying. The water that feeds their food sources is drying up, and the young ones are starving. That's why they keep trying to come up, not to hurt people, but to find new places to live. Agent Harrison nodded grimly. Every 30 to 40 years, population pressure forces them to attempt surface colonization. Every time, families like yours have pushed them back down. But the underground environment is becoming increasingly unsustainable. So the boundary stones, Eli said slowly, they weren't protecting us from them. They were protecting them from us, keeping them hidden, keeping them contained so the surface world wouldn't discover them. Exactly. And more than that, they were protecting both species from a conflict that would be catastrophic for everyone involved. The creatures retain enough of their original intelligence to understand tools, to learn, to adapt. If they were forced into open conflict with human civilization, the results would be he was interrupted by Agent Santos, who burst through the firehall doors with news that made everyone's blood freeze. Sir, we have a problem. Multiple problems. The boundary around the affected area is failing. We have confirmed sightings of the creatures at farms up to 10 miles from the original sites. And she paused, clearly struggling with what she had to report. Sir, they're not just randomly emerging anymore. They're organized. They appear to be conducting coordinated reconnaissance of human settlements. Through the windows, they could see distant fires on the horizon, not the controlled burn-offs of emergency flares, but the orange glow of structures burning. Car alarms wailed in a continuous chorus, and the emergency radio channels crackled with reports of sightings from across Lancaster County. How many? Bishop Miller asked quietly. Agent Santos consulted her radio reports. Conservative estimate? Several hundred individuals across multiple emergence sites. And that's just what we can confirm on the surface. Underground movement suggests much larger numbers still below ground. The full scope of the crisis was becoming clear. This wasn't an isolated incident that could be contained with a few boundary stones and forgotten prayers. This was a population migration, driven by desperation and environmental collapse in the deep places where the creatures had made their homes. Samuel tugged at Eli's sleeve, his young face grave with understanding beyond his years. Grostadi, they remember you. Your family, I mean. They remember great-great Grostadi and all the others who helped them hide. But they also remember the promises. What promises? The promises the first Guardians made. That if the deep cities ever died completely, if they had no choice but to come to the surface forever, the Guardian families would help them find new homes, safe places where both peoples could live. Agent Harrison's files suddenly took on new meaning as Eli realized what he was looking at. The government hadn't just been containing the creatures, they had been preparing for this exact scenario. The classified documents detailed contingency plans for permanent surface, integration of subterranean populations, complete with habitat, requirements and compatibility assessments. You knew this day would come, Eli said. Not really a question. Environmental scientists have been tracking groundwater depletion in the deep aquifer systems for decades. We knew the underground ecosystem was failing. The question wasn't whether the creatures would be forced to the surface permanently, but when. Dr. Harper looked up from her instruments with an expression of scientific fascination mixed with terror. The seismic readings, they're not random emergence patterns anymore. They're following deliberate routes, like they're mapping the surface systematically. This isn't panic behavior. This is colonization behavior. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. The creatures weren't just coming up to hunt or explore. They were coming up to stay. 12,000 years of underground civilization was ending, and an entire species was attempting to reclaim the surface world their ancestors had been forced to abandon. The boundary stones, Sarah said quietly. They can't contain a full population migration. Agent Harrison shook his head. The old containment protocols were designed for small groups of scouts or hunting parties. They were never intended to handle an entire civilization on the move. Samuel's hand found Eli's, small fingers gripping with surprising strength. They want to make a deal, Grosdadi. The old ones, the smart ones who remember the surface world, they want to talk to the Guardian families. They know they can't go back down, but they also know they can't survive up here without help. What kind of deal? They need places to live where humans won't find them. Deep places, but not so deep that they can't reach the surface when they need to. And they need... Samuel paused, his young mind struggling with concepts that shouldn't exist in a child's vocabulary. They need to hunt, but they don't want to hunt people. They remember being people, sort of. They want to hunt the things people don't want, the pests, the sick animals, the creatures that spread disease. Agent Harrison leaned forward intently. Symbiosis. They're proposing a symbiotic relationship. The fire hall shook again, more violently than before. And this time they could hear sounds from underground, not the random scraping and movement they had grown accustomed to, but something that sounded almost like communication. Deep resonant calls that seemed to echo through the earth itself, answered by similar sounds from multiple directions. They're calling to each other, Dr. Harper realized. Coordinating! This is organized behavior on a scale we haven't seen before. Eli stood slowly, the weight of his family's true heritage settling on his shoulders like a mantle he had never asked to wear. 4 generations of Zooks had served as unknowing guardians, maintaining barriers that were always meant to be temporary. Now the barriers were failing, not because they had been neglected, but because they were no longer needed. The age of containment was ending. The age of coexistence was about to begin, and as if to emphasize that point, the fire hall's lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness broken only by the eerie, phosphorescent glow visible through the windows, the light of an ancient civilization finally emerging from the depths to reclaim their place in the world above. In the darkness of the fire hall, with only the eerie phosphorescent glow from outside to see by, the assembled group faced a choice that would determine the fate of 2 species. Agent Harrison's emergency radio crackled with increasingly desperate reports from the perimeter teams. The creatures were emerging in organized groups, moving with purpose through the countryside, avoiding direct confrontation but clearly establishing territorial markers. We have maybe 6 hours before this becomes a national emergency, Agent Harrison said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Once the media gets hold of footage of organized non-human intelligence, once the public realizes what we're dealing with, any chance for peaceful resolution disappears. Fear will drive policy, and policy will demand military solutions. Eli studied Wilhelm's journal by flashlight, searching for any mention of negotiation protocols or communication methods. Samuel sat beside him, his young face pale but determined, serving as their only reliable translator for the alien intelligence that pulsed beneath their feet. "Great Grossdaddy mentions a gathering stone," Eli said finally, finding a passage written in faded ink. A place where the Guardians could meet with the Erdgeist leaders when decisions needed to be made. "But he doesn't say where it is." Samuel closed his eyes, his small hand pressing against the wooden floor as if he could feel vibrations the adults couldn't detect. "They know where it is. The old ones remember. It's in the deep part of your farm, Grossdaddy, where the creek bends around the big rocks. Dr. Harper consulted her geological surveys, tracing underground water flows with her finger. There's a significant limestone formation there, with natural chambers. If they've been using it as a meeting place for over a century, it would be neutral ground," Agent Harrison finished. "Somewhere both species could gather safely." Bishop Miller stood slowly, his weathered hands steady despite the gravity of their situation. "Brother Eli, if God has chosen your family to bear this burden, then we must trust in his plan. But you should not face this alone." Around the fire hall, other Amish families nodded in agreement. These were people who understood community responsibility, who had faced hardship together for generations. The fact that this particular hardship involved ancient underground civilizations didn't change their fundamental approach to crisis. They would meet it together. "With faith and practical action, I'll need volunteers," Eli said quietly. "People willing to risk their lives on the chance that we can prevent a war between our peoples." Hands rose throughout the room, not just Amish hands, but English neighbors, government agents, even Dr. Harper with her scientific instruments. The crisis had dissolved normal social boundaries, creating a temporary community united by necessity. Agent Santos coordinated with her superiors by radio, buying them time by reporting that negotiations were in progress and that military intervention should be delayed pending diplomatic resolution. It was a fragile fiction, but it might hold long enough for them to attempt contact. Sarah appeared at Eli's side with a canvas bag filled with items that spoke of preparations spanning generations. The iron horseshoe blessed by Wilhelm himself, candles made from beeswax produced on their own land, salt from the old cellar stores, items that seemed mundane but carried the weight of tradition and faith. "Your great-grandfather's walking stick," she said, pressing the carved oak staff into his hands. "If we're doing this, we do it properly." Outside, the phosphorescent glow was growing brighter, and they could see shapes moving with deliberate purpose through the distant fields. The creatures were converging on specific locations, following patterns that suggested complex communication and organization. Jacob approached his father with visible reluctance. "Dad, let me take Samuel home." "Whatever you're planning to do, he's too young." "No," Samuel interrupted with startling firmness. "I'm the only one who can hear them clearly, and they trust me because I'm young. They remember being young too, before they had to live in the dark places so long." The boy's words carried weight beyond his years, and Jacob's protest died in his throat. Whatever was happening to his son, whatever strange gift or burden Samuel carried, it was clearly essential to any hope of peaceful resolution. Dr. Harper finished her preparations, loading equipment that could record and analyze whatever they might encounter. Agent Harrison checked communication devices that would allow him to coordinate with federal response teams. The volunteers gathered supplies and steeled themselves for a journey into unknown territory. But it was Eli who faced the greatest challenge, not just the physical danger of entering the creature's domain, but the psychological weight of accepting his family's true role in events that had shaped regional history for over a century. "I keep thinking about my father," he said quietly to Sarah as they prepared to leave the fire hall. All those years he carried this knowledge alone, never sharing it because he thought the burden would die with him. Maybe he hoped it would. Sarah replied. Maybe each generation hopes their children won't have to face what they've faced. But the burden doesn't disappear just because we ignore it. Samuel tugged at his grandfather's coat. Daddy, they're ready for us. The gathering stone is active. I can feel it humming beneath the ground. But we need to hurry. Some of the young ones are getting scared and angry, and the old ones can't control them much longer. The convoy that formed outside the fire hall was unlike anything Lancaster County had ever seen. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights escorted civilian cars, carrying Amish families alongside government agents with high-tech equipment. At the center of it all, Eli rode in Tom Morrison's pickup truck, Samuel beside him, both carrying the weight of knowledge that could either save two species or witness the beginning of an interspecies war. The phosphorescent glow grew stronger as they approached the Zook farm, and they could see the creatures more clearly now, dozens of them moving through the fields with fluid grace, their pale forms catching and reflecting the strange light like living moonbeams. They maintained careful distance from the human convoy, but their presence was unmistakably coordinated. They're beautiful, Dr. Harper said softly, observing through night vision equipment. Terrible and beautiful. Like angels that have spent too long in darkness, the gathering stone revealed itself as they crested the rise overlooking the creek bend. What Eli had always assumed was a natural limestone outcropping was clearly artificial. Carved surfaces covered with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the phosphorescent light. Around its base, the creatures had arranged themselves in concentric circles, largest and most ancient toward the center, younger ones forming outer rings. At the very center, on a raised platform carved from the living stone, waited a figure that was unmistakably their leader. Larger than the others, with bone-white skin that seemed to generate its own light, it possessed an alien dignity that spoke of intelligence shaped by millennia of survival in impossible conditions. Samuel gripped Eli's hand tightly as they approached the gathering stone on foot, the other volunteers forming a protective circle around them. Its name is... He paused, struggling with concepts that had no human equivalent. Old Deep thought. It remembers the surface world from before the ice. It remembers the first agreements with the guardian families. The ancient creature's eyeless face turned toward them, and when it spoke, the words bypassed normal hearing to resonate directly in their minds. Not telepathy exactly, but communication through vibrations that their bones interpreted as meaning. Young guardian heir, the voice seemed to say, though no sound disturbed the air. The deep cities die, the young ones hunger. The old agreements must be renewed or broken. Choose. Eli stepped forward, his great-grandfather's walking stick steady in his hands, the iron horseshoe warm in his pocket. Around him, two species that had coexisted in secret for over a century waited for words that would determine their shared future. I choose renewal, he said simply. But the world has changed. The old ways of hiding are no longer possible. If our peoples are to survive together, we must find new agreements. The phosphorescent light pulsed brighter, and Old Deep Thought's response carried the weight of ancient wisdom and desperate hope. Then let us begin. The negotiation began not with words, but with memory. Old Deep Thought sharing images that flowed directly into the minds of everyone present, showing them the world as it had existed 12,000 years ago. Green forests where ice now scarred the earth, flowing rivers where deserts now stretched, and among it all, the creatures living in harmony with early humans, both species young and learning to understand their shared world. Samuel trembled beside Eli, his small frame overwhelmed by the flood of ancient recollections. Through the boys' translations, they saw the great cooling, the desperate retreat underground, the gradual adaptation to a subterranean existence that had never been meant to be permanent. They felt the creatures' sorrow as their surface-dwelling kin died, one by one, leaving only the deep-adapted survivors to carry on their civilization in darkness. They helped build the first human settlements, Samuel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. They knew things about stone and water, about working with the earth instead of against it. The early humans learned from them, Dr. Harper's instruments registered electromagnetic fluctuations as the memory sharing intensified, her scientific mind struggling to categorize phenomena that defied conventional understanding. But the data was undeniable. Some form of direct neural communication was taking place between species separated by millions of years of evolution. Old Deep Thought's attention turned to Eli, and suddenly he was experiencing his own family history through alien perspective. Wilhelm meeting with creature elders in this very spot, establishing the boundaries not as prison walls, but as protective barriers, keeping both species safe from conflicts neither was prepared to handle. Abraham's failed attempt to renew the agreements alone, his death serving as testament to the dangers of incomplete knowledge. And now Eli himself, carrying forward a burden he had never chosen but could not abandon. The deep cities were meant to be temporary shelter. Old Deep Thought's mental voice carried the weight of centuries of disappointment. We waited for the ice to retreat, for the surface world to warm again. But the warm time brought new dangers. Your people, multiplying, spreading, claiming all lands as their own. Agent Harrison stepped forward carefully, his government training helping him maintain composure in circumstances that challenged every assumption about human dominance on Earth. What do you need from us? What would allow your people to survive? The answer came not as words, but as images, carved out spaces deep enough to provide security, but shallow enough to maintain connection with the surface world. Underground chambers that could house the creature's unique ecosystem, while allowing access to resources both above and below ground. Most importantly, protected territories where they could practice their ancient ways without human interference. The old boundaries contained us to places too small for our growing numbers. Old Deep Thought continued. The young ones need space to learn, to grow, to develop the skills that keep our people alive. We need hunting grounds where we can take the animals you consider pests, the creatures that carry disease, that damage your crops, that multiply beyond control. Samuel looked up at his grandfather with eyes that held impossible understanding. They want to help, Grossdaddy. They want to be part of keeping the balance, like they used to do before the ice. But they need places where they won't be hunted or studied or feared. It was Bishop Miller who spoke the question everyone was thinking. And if we cannot provide these things, if our people are too frightened, too set in their ways to accept such an arrangement. Old Deep Thought's response carried the chill of absolute finality. Then the young ones will take what they need to survive. They are not like us. They do not remember the old agreements, do not understand the value of cooperation. To them, your people are simply another species competing for resources they require. They will hunt, they will claim territory, they will defend their young against any perceived threat. The implications hung heavy in the night air. Peaceful coexistence or species-level warfare. There would be no middle ground. Dr. Harper checked her readings again, noting increased seismic activity from multiple directions. The creatures gathering around the other Burrow sites, they're waiting for word from here, aren't they? The council gathering spreads across all the deep territories, Old Deep Thought confirmed. What we decide here determines the actions of all our people. The young ones grow impatient. They smell the rich hunting above ground, feel the space where they could expand. If we cannot reach new agreements soon, they will come whether we lead them or not. Eli felt the weight of his great-grandfather's walking stick in his hands, the carved oak worn smooth by generations of Zook hands. Wilhelm had faced this same decision over a century ago, choosing cooperation over conflict, secrecy over exposure. But the world had changed. The old solutions were no longer adequate for the current crisis. We need to establish new boundaries, he said finally. Larger territories, but still defined. Places where your people can live and hunt without endangering human populations. And where humans can live without fear of accidentally disturbing your communities. The ritual circle stones, Samuel added, his young voice carrying ancient knowledge. 7 markers, but placed differently than before. Not to trap or hide, but to mark the boundaries of shared territory. Old Deep Thought's phosphorescent form pulsed brighter. And around the gathering stone, hundreds of creatures swayed in unison. Their collective response to the proposed solution. The stones can be placed, the ancient being agreed. But they must be consecrated with the old words, blessed by representatives of both peoples, and maintained by guardians who understand their true purpose. Eli nodded, accepting the weight of destiny that had pursued his family for 4 generations. Then let us begin the ritual. Let us create new boundaries for a new age. The placement of the 7 boundary stones required a journey through territory that had become alien overnight. Eli led the procession with Samuel at his side, the boy's connection to the creatures serving as their guide through landscapes transformed by underground emergence. Behind them came the volunteers, Amish farmers, English neighbors, government agents, and Dr. Harper with her scientific equipment, all united in the desperate hope that ancient rituals could prevent modern warfare. The first stone went at the original location near the creek bend, where Wilhelm had placed it over a century ago. Old Deep Thought's mental voice guided them through words that predated any human language, syllables that seemed to resonate directly with the earth itself. As Eli spoke the ritual phrases, translating through Samuel's impossible linguistic bridge, the stone began to emit a soft, phosphorescent glow that matched the creature's own bioluminescence. "It's working," Dr. Harper whispered, her instruments registering harmonic frequencies that suggested the stone was somehow attuned to the underground acoustic systems. The electromagnetic signature is stabilizing, creating a defined field boundary. But even as the first marker activated successfully, they could see signs of growing unrest among the younger creatures. Groups of them prowled the perimeter of the gathering, their movements more aggressive, less controlled than their elders. The hunger of centuries was driving them toward desperation, and Old Deep Thought's influence was clearly being challenged by voices that favored immediate action over careful negotiation. The second stone required a journey to the Morrison property line, where Tom Morrison himself stepped forward to participate in the blessing ritual. As an English neighbor who had lived alongside the Amish community for decades, his presence represented the broader human acceptance that would be necessary for any long-term solution. "I don't understand what we're doing," he admitted quietly as they prepared the stone. "But I trust you, Eli. If your family has been keeping us safe all these years, then I figure you know what you're about." The third stone revealed the first serious complication. As they approached the designated location near the Johnson farm, they found it occupied by a group of young creatures who showed no inclination to move aside for the ritual procession. Their pale forms clustered around something in the darkness, the remains of the missing cattle, Eli realized with a sick feeling. The creatures had been feeding, and the blood scent had attracted others. Samuel approached them carefully, his small form dwarfed by beings that towered over him like nightmarish scarecrows. But when he spoke, using words that bypassed human language entirely, the young creatures stepped back reluctantly, their eyeless faces turning toward him with something that might have been respect or curiosity. "They're hungry," Samuel explained as the adults prepared the third stone. Really hungry. They say the deep food stopped growing seasons ago, and surface food doesn't give them what they need to stay strong." "What is deep food?" Dr. Harper asked, her scientific mind cataloging every detail. "Fungi," Samuel replied after a moment's mental consultation. "Special mushrooms that only grow in the deepest caves, where the water seeps through rock that's been there since the beginning. But the water stopped coming, so the mushrooms died, and now..." He was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the fourth stone location. Emergency vehicles raced toward the site, their lights cutting through the darkness as Agent Santos's voice crackled over the radio with urgent reports. Multiple breach points opening simultaneously across the county. "We have creatures emerging at locations outside the established perimeter. Repeat, containment has been lost." Old Deep Thought's mental voice carried new urgency as the ancient being shared images of chaos spreading through the creature community. The careful hierarchy that had maintained order for generations was breaking down as younger, Hungrier individuals refuse to wait for diplomatic solutions to their immediate needs. The young ones scatter, Old Deep Thought reported. They seek hunting grounds, nesting places, territory to claim before the boundaries restrict them. The council gathering loses authority. Eli realized they were racing against time as social order collapsed among an entire civilization. The boundary stones could establish new territories and rules for coexistence, but only if they could be placed and activated before the creatures dispersed beyond any hope of peaceful organization. We need to move faster, he decided, dividing their group to place multiple stones simultaneously. Samuel, can you communicate with the scattered groups? Can you tell them to wait just a little longer? The boy closed his eyes, his small form trembling with effort as he reached out across impossible distances to touch minds that were increasingly focused on survival rather than cooperation. When he opened his eyes again, tears were streaming down his face. Some of them will listen, he said quietly. But others are too hungry, too scared. They think the surface world is going to try to push them back down into the dying places. They'd rather fight than go back. As if to emphasize his words, distant explosions lit the horizon, military ordnance being deployed against creatures that were no longer contained to the agreed-upon areas. The window for peaceful resolution was closing rapidly. Then we finish this, Eli said grimly, lifting the final boundary stone with hands that shook from exhaustion and determination. We complete the ritual and hope that 7 stones can hold back a war. The phosphorescent glow from the placed markers was already creating a visible network across the landscape, but whether it would be enough to prevent the catastrophe that was spreading across Lancaster County remained to be seen. Dawn came quietly to Lancaster County, the first light revealing a landscape forever changed by the events of a single night. The 7th boundary stone stood at the center of what had once been Eli's wheat field. Its phosphorescent glow now part of a network that stretched across 7 farms, creating a visible grid of light that could be seen from miles away. Within those boundaries, an ancient civilization was learning to live in the surface world again, while outside them, human communities were coming to terms with the reality that they were no longer alone on Earth. Eli sat on his front porch in the early morning stillness, his great-grandfather's walking stick resting across his knees, watching as government vehicles and news crews maintained their respectful distance beyond the boundary markers. The agreement negotiated in those desperate hours before dawn had held, barely. Military intervention had been called off when the creatures proved they could retreat to the designated areas voluntarily, demonstrating both their intelligence and their willingness to abide by negotiated limits. Samuel emerged from the house, carrying 2 cups of Sarah's coffee, moving with the careful solemnity of a boy who had aged years in a single night. The psychic connection that had allowed him to serve as translator between species had not faded with daylight, and Eli could see in his grandson's eyes the weight of knowledge that no 10-year-old should carry. "They're settling in," Samuel reported, settling beside his grandfather on the porch steps. "The old ones are teaching the young ones how to build proper homes in the shallow caves. They say it will take time to learn how to live with sunlight again, but they remember some things from the before times. Through the morning mist, they could see figures moving among the boundary stones, not the desperate, hungry creatures of the previous night, but individuals going about the business of establishing a new community. Dr. Harper had remained within the boundaries, documenting everything with scientific fascination, while Agent Harrison coordinated with his superiors to establish the legal framework that would protect both species under law. "The news people want to interview us," Samuel continued. "They want to know how we knew what to do." Eli nodded slowly, understanding that their family's long period of secrecy was ending. The boundary stones glowed with energy that satellites could detect, and the creatures themselves were no longer hiding from human observation. Within days, the world would know that humanity shared the planet with another intelligent species, and the Zook family would be at the center of that revelation, What do you think great-great-gross-daddy would say about all this? Eli asked. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his young face thoughtful. I think he would say, we did what needed to be done. The Erdgeist aren't secrets anymore, but they're also not enemies. That's better than the old way. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression mixing exhaustion with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had watched her family rise to meet an impossible challenge. Bishop Miller is here, she announced. He wants to discuss how the community will handle the attention we're going to receive. The Amish community faced its own crisis of adaptation. Their traditional isolation from the modern world had been shattered by events that demanded engagement with media, government, and scientific institutions. But as Bishop Miller settled into their kitchen to discuss these challenges, Eli realized that his people possessed exactly the qualities needed to navigate the new reality: patience, faith, and the wisdom that came from generations of living simply and sustainably. Over the following weeks, Lancaster County became a focal point for scientific study, diplomatic negotiation, and media attention, unlike anything in human history. Dr. Harper established the first interspecies research station, where human scientists worked alongside creature knowledge keepers to understand technologies and biological processes that had developed in isolation for millennia. The creatures' mastery of biotechnology, their understanding of sustainable ecosystems, and their ability to work with natural processes rather than against them offered solutions to environmental challenges that human science was only beginning to comprehend. Agent Harrison found himself coordinating the establishment of similar boundary networks in other locations where creature populations had been detected: the Vermont mountains, the Ohio River valleys, the Arkansas forests. Each site required local guardians, families or communities, willing to serve as bridges between species. And each successful establishment strengthened the framework for permanent coexistence. Samuel's role evolved as well. His unique ability to communicate with the creatures made him invaluable to the ongoing negotiations. But Eli insisted that his grandson's childhood be preserved as much as possible. The boy attended regular school, played with friends, helped with farm chores, but he also spent time each day within the boundary markers, serving as liaison between species and learning the responsibilities he would inherit as the next generation's guardian. "Will you teach me the old words?" Samuel asked one evening as they walked among the boundary stones, watching the phosphorescent network pulse with life. "The ones great-great-gross-daddy used?" Eli smiled, realizing that the knowledge that had skipped his generation would find its way into safe hands after all. "I'll teach you everything I've learned," he promised. "And you'll probably learn things I never imagined." The final entry in Eli's new journal, the record he had begun to maintain for future generations, reflected on the transformation that had overtaken their quiet farming community. The Erdgeist are no longer visitors in our world. They are neighbors. The boundaries we established mark not walls between peoples, but doorways to understanding. Samuel grows stronger in his gift each day, and I see in him the wisdom to carry this responsibility forward. The land holds both our peoples now, and perhaps that was always how it was meant to be. We are guardians still, but guardians of cooperation rather than separation, of hope rather than fear. As autumn deepened into winter, the boundary stones continued their quiet vigil, marking territories where two species learned to share the earth their ancestors had once known together. The burrow in Eli's wheat field remained, but it was no longer a source of fear. It had become a symbol of emergence, of ancient knowledge rising to meet modern needs, of the hope that understanding could triumph over fear. And in the depths below, where phosphorescent cities once again hummed with life, the Erdgeist elders added new chapters to their own histories, chronicles of the day when their long exile ended, and they returned to the surface world not as conquerors, but as partners in the ongoing story of life on Earth.